welcome to History Now. As we're fast approaching the 100th anniversary of the 1918 general election, an election which was known in Ireland as the Sinn Féin Election, where the party won 73 out of the 105 seats on offer. But that doesn't tell the whole story. In today's show we're going to be discussing it with Dr. Alan de Bromhead, an economic historian from Queen's University, and Donal Fallon. Donal has worked on a number of TV programmes for RTE, including National Treasures and Who Do You Think You Are, and is one of the people behind the enormously successful blog Come Here To Me. You're both very welcome. So Donal, if I can go to you first, it's very hard to sort of overstate it. This was a massive event in terms of politics in Ireland. Can you sort of give us a bit of a background on that, on how it was a massive change?
It is it's a turning point moment, and I think there's a tendency in this decade of centenaries that we're living through to put phenomenal emphasis on the military engagements, you know, the 1916 Rising, the burning GPO, the War of Independence and the Civil War. But in the interim between those incidents, an awful lot of what's happening is really remarkable political change. And the Irish Revolution in many ways shifts. You know, the Rising, I think, involved no more than 1,800 armed men, women and children, and that's probably a generous figure. By 1917 and 1918, what you're seeing happening is tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people are coming into the political fold. And one police inspector very beautifully described the 1918 general election as the victory of the young over the old. And in some ways, this is what it was. It was a new, youthful, energized political movement taking its place. And I mean, this was a difficult road to get to this point. When you look at the by-elections of 1917 and 1918, they hadn't all gone Sinn Féin's way. I mean, going into this election, the Irish Parliamentary Party was not quite dead in the water. And this was a real challenge for what was fundamentally, I think, a very young party. And was the Sinn Féin that contested the 1918 general election the same Sinn Féin that Arthur Griffith had created in 1905? I don't think it was. I mean, they had a new manifesto, they had a new leader. They stood on, this was the first time really that this Republican message was put before an electorate.
Mm-hmm. And Alan, if you go to you, your research, one of your current areas of research is analysing the results of the 1918 election. Can you tell us about that and how you went about analysing those results?
So we wanted to look at the factors that determined support for Sinn Féin across Ireland in 1918. So we collected information on the election results and combined this with information on demographic factors from the 1911 census of Ireland. Things like occupation, literacy rates and religion, things like that. But what we were mainly interested in was the number of new voters in each constituency and the relationship between this number and support for Sinn Féin in 1918 to test this hypothesis that the increase in new voters in the 1918 election was a direct benefit to Sinn Féin and led ultimately to their victory.
It's sometimes said that the Irish Parliamentary Party vote remained more or less steady. So it wasn't that the IPP's vote collapsed. In some places, their candidates got something like 400 less votes than they got in the last general election. So it's the new sway of younger voters and female voters that are the contributing factor?
Well, I think that when you consider the change in the electorate, it is tempting to make that connection between this increased electorate and the support for Sinn Féin being sort of mechanically related to this. I think we need to be careful with making that direct connection. That's what we try and do in our research, is to test that empirically, to try and understand whether this was actually a determining factor in the Sinn Féin victory. We find that this wasn't, according to our, or doesn't appear to be a determining factor in the Sinn Féin victory. And I think what is often misleading or often forgotten is the inclusion of women in the electorate for the first time, who were older and were subject to a property requirement that you may expect to lead them to be more conservative in their attitudes. And so the sort of idea that the electorate became extremely youthful in 1918 is perhaps determined by the new male voters rather than the new female voters, who actually outnumbered the new male voters.
Yeah, and back to you on that point, Donal, something that you had said to me about, you know, you had a new working class block of male voters. Was that confined to the cities, the big towns, or what was the picture?
Well, I do think, again, in this decade of centenaries, commemorating things, a lot of our commemorative focus is focused on contemporary politics, you know, and a lot of the work in 2016 and this year has been on the role of women. And this point was emphasised all the time this year. This is the centenary of the vote that gave, or the act that gave the vote to women for the first time. But the Representation of the People Act also puts the vote into the hands of phenomenal numbers of working class men for the first time in Britain. And women, I mean, in some ways women had the vote already, like in terms of local elections. In Dublin you had a long tradition of people like Jenny Wise Power, you know, female nationalist councillors. Women had some political engagement before at that level of politics. But the Representation of the People Act, it's not just women that are given the vote, but certain women. But it's the transformation, I suppose, of the political landscape to include phenomenal numbers of working class men, and young working class men too. And there's a political fear around that in some quarters, including from people like Edward Carson, you know, leader of Ulster Unionism, that this could lead to Bolshevism. You know, that if you look at the world as it's developing in 1917 and 1918, putting the vote into the hands of working class men may be a potentially dangerous thing to do. That's why you see, you know, the rise of what's called the Labour Unionists, you know, here in Belfast, this kind of attempt by unionism to corral the rise of what they see as interlinked threats of, you know, Sinn Féin in one corner and Bolshevism in the other. But the fear that if you put the vote into the hands of millions of working class men, they'd all vote for the left, that didn't materialise in the end. I'm sure the Labour Party in Britain hoped it would, but it didn't materialise in that way. Yeah,
so just going back to that, in terms of Labour can wait, you know, where Labour stood aside for Sinn Féin, how did that play out in terms of the working class men's vote?
What an exciting time to be part of the Labour movement in 1918. You think about what's happened in the world. You have the birth of the world's first socialist state in 1917. 10,000 people rally at the Mansion House in Dublin in February 1918, including representatives of Belfast Labour, to celebrate the Bolshevik Revolution. That's just an extraordinary sight. I mean, that figure comes from the Dublin Metropolitan Police. They're spilling around the corner, they're singing the red flag. And Thomas Johnson of the Labour Party, he believes that this great moment has come. And his newspaper, Irish Opinion, their front page, it's fantastic. It says, you know, if the Bolsheviks came to Ireland, what would happen? What would society look like? And I think they felt, people like Johnson and also people like, you know, the Labour movement in Glasgow, they felt like this revolution would spill across borders and their time had come. But the idea of this slogan, Labour must wait, I mean, Labour initially intended to contest that election. Thomas Johnson, William O'Brien and others met and they discussed this, should we stand? And I think feeling that it was Labour's moment, they intended to. But slowly but surely, word was coming in from Irish Transport General Workers Union branches around the country saying, look, you know, our people are going to be canvassing for Sinn Féin. You know, in some cases, our branch secretary wants to run for Sinn Féin. In other words, this was becoming, in the eyes of the people, very much a referendum on the national question. And I think Johnson realised that earlier on. And the thing about Sinn Féin, they were a kind of catch-all party. You know, they appealed right across social classes, but including to the working classes, people that naturally would have had a home or would have had a vote with the Labour Party. They were drifting in the Sinn Féin as well. So I think they recognised Labour that, unfortunately for them, this had become something of a referendum on the question of national independence. And when you look at how they do later on, the first elections in the Free State, Labour has an extraordinary day out. I think they run 18 candidates and 17 of them are elected. I mean, they've never performed so well in a general election as they did there. And if they ran more people, they would have got elected as well. So there was a desire, there was a political desire, I think, among sections of the population for a very, very strong Labour Party. But Johnson and O'Brien, they made the decision themselves to step aside. There was no gun put to their head.
Labour's decision to stand aside is often being criticised as the reason that Labour never established a foothold in the early movement. But of course, in the 1920 local elections, the urban elections, Labour does very well. And this is under the new proportional representation system, which had been brought in to limit the prospects for Sinn Féin. But the fact that Labour does so well, they may not have done so well under the first past the post system that the 1918 general election would have been fought under. So we can understand also the decision not to try and get involved in a referendum on the type of nationalism that Ireland was going to pursue going forward.
They're a recognised part of a very broad nationalist movement. I mean, by the time of the 1918 general election, Labour has found its feet and its voice. The general strike against conscription in 1918 is the first successful general strike on that scale in Europe. There'd been nothing like it. And it was the Irish Times, no friend of the Labour movement of the day, who described that as the day Irish Labour found its strength. So this was a well-organised machine. Wartime inflation, you had strikes. The Irish Transport and General Workers Union is a very strong political machine, 1917 and 1918.
Yeah, and that's something that you look at in your paper on the election. You talk about two different hypotheses. There's one is the hypothesis of the enfranchisement. There's the other that you talk about, that it's the other events that lead up to it. So can you perhaps just tell us about the hypothesis, the extension hypothesis?
The question we wanted to ask was, firstly, do we see greater support for Sinn Féin where there are more new voters in the electorate? If you do see that, it suggests that, although not mechanically, but it does suggest that new voters may have disproportionately voted for Sinn Féin. And as such, we could imagine that the Representation of the People Act therefore directly benefited Sinn Féin. So that's really the first hypothesis, that this was the reason behind the Sinn Féin victory in 1918. Now, our research doesn't find support for that hypothesis. We don't find a link between new male voters and support for Sinn Féin in 1918. We find that where there are more female voters, support for Sinn Féin may indeed be lower. And what this leads us to conclude really is that other factors must have played a greater role in the Sinn Féin victory in 1918. And that if it wasn't a change in the electorate that drove this result, then we see it more as a change of heart of the electorate or the people of Ireland that is responsible for this electoral victory.
Yeah. And that's something that you've looked at, Donal, in terms of, you alluded earlier, the strike, the conscription strike. There's other factors at play here, including one that you've given a talk on recently, on the likes of Gaelic Sunday, things like that. Are they all contributing factors, do you think?
I think when you look at Sinn Féin going into the 1918 general election, what they have behind them is they have an army of young people that are now quite politically skilled. I mean, they've been involved in things like the conscription strike, also Gaelic Sunday. I mean, that's an incredible moment of defiance. August 1918, there's essentially a ban introduced on Gaelic games. You need to apply for a permit to organise a clash. And the GAA response to it is not only to boycott the ban, but to play 1,500 games at once, right across the island of Ireland in this kind of unprecedented act of defiance. So the politics of the street, in 1917 and 1918, there's an awful lot of that going on. Even the commemorations, at Easter, in both of those years, are very, very significant. So you take the Irish Parliamentary Party, you have a political machine where in many cases parliamentarians have been MPs going back through general elections. They've never stood contested. They don't have that rank and file. But Sinn Féin is this well-organised machine. And you read the Bureau of Military History witness statements, young lads from Dublin in the Irish Citizen Army find themselves down in, say, Tipperary, canvassing door to door. People in Cumann are postering at night. So you have this very vibrant and willing to go. And I think that rank and file political membership is what separates the IPP from Sinn Féin in the election, with some exceptions. In parts of the country, Wexford in particular, and indeed in parts of Belfast, there's very real violence where the IPP does have a party base and it's willing to fight with Sinn Féin on the streets.
So yeah, the way Donal speaks there about different parts of Ireland, in your research, is there anything like that you, the results that come out of it, that are, it's patchy rather than a large block of change?
So we try and take a whole Ireland approach really, to try and look at the overall picture and look at the overall results. I'm sure there's plenty of variation at the local level in terms of support. We have IPP winning one seat in the Waterford constituency, the Redmond seat. We have a Unionist being elected in Rathmines and in Trinity College, of course. But other than that, it's pretty much a clean sweep for Sinn Féin. And what is also important is that 25 seats are uncontested in this election. And these seats, if you want to look for sort of a pattern, a geographical pattern, these are in the south and in the west, in Munster and in Connacht mainly. So the figures that we have for support for Sinn Féin, for the vote that actually Sinn Féin received, understates the true level of support, because no votes were cast in those constituencies. And we can assume that these were the reason they were not contested by the Irish Parliamentary Party, who had held these seats, many of these seats, for decades, was that they were so sure that this was going to be a Sinn Féin victory that they thought, we will pick our battles and fight them elsewhere. In
17 and 18, some of the by-elections had gone the Irish Parliamentary Party's way, but maybe as the winds of change were blowing with such force by the winter of 1918 that they decided to step aside. For Southern Unionism, it's a crisis. It's an absolute crisis. It's such a stereotypical, Rathmines and Trinity College Dublin stay in their hands, they lose everything else. And you get this crisis meeting in Dublin then in the early months of 1919 in the Freemasons' Hall on Molesworth Street, where essentially Southern Unionists say, we've lost, what do we do now? And I think if you look at someone like Edward Carson, to my mind, Edward Carson was never an Ulster Unionist, he was an Irish Unionist. Carson believed that Ireland's place as an island was within the empire. And I think for them, it was a great loss. I mean, while the Unionists performed well in Ulster, Carson's view of it, and he said it himself, was that it wasn't that 6 counties were won. At the end of the day, it's that 26 were lost. Yeah.
Can I just go back to something there, we were talking about the by-elections? Have you looked at those, and can you tell us what that perhaps told us about what was going to come on in 1918?
Well, I think what the by-elections tell us is that it was not yet a foregone conclusion that Sinn Féin would win by such a margin in 1918. I think clearly their early victories gave the party a taste of what electoral politics was about and how they could use this to further their aims. The by-elections that were lost by Sinn Féin, that the Irish Parliamentary Party won, clearly were setbacks, and they knew that they would have a fight in their hands in some ways to take over as the main nationalist party in Ireland. But I think the 1918 experience and what comes out from the conscription crisis starts to gain more and more sort of prominence in this debate. That Sinn Féin were able to position themselves as the party that would protect the Irish people from conscription, which was on the statute books and could be enacted at any time. Even though the Irish Parliamentary Party and all of nationalist Ireland was firmly against this and were aggressively against this and opposed this forcibly, the fact that Sinn Féin was able to play on the Irish Parliamentary Party's support for the war initially in 1914 allowed them to claim this as their struggle, which I think may help us to understand the big change in public opinion in 1918.
Yeah. Both of you have said about the IPP holding their positions for decades at some point. And this old versus young thing comes out, but there's something that you've looked at in terms of Belfast and sort of violence around between Sinn Féin and the IPP in Belfast.
Both Waterford and Belfast witnessed significant scenes of violence, but the worst of it is definitely in West Belfast. And I suppose politics here are of course, they're more complex because of the sectarian questions, and you have the presence of the ancient order of Hibernians as a real political force in Irish life and as a real power in terms of influencing the IPP in the north in particular. And Joe Devlin, who's a brilliant political operator, has the backing of the ancient order of Hibernians. And the line that's very much pushed in West Belfast is that these Sinn Féin canvassers and the like are these young upstarts from the south. They don't live here, they don't know anything about our politics, and they don't know anything about the sectarian tensions of living in Belfast. So Kevin O'Sheil, later very important in the Dáil court system, in his Bureau of Military History witness statement, he talks about canvassing in West Belfast, and it's just incredible. He says there were dead cats, there were rats, there were fireworks, everything you could name was being thrown at Sinn Féin canvassers on the streets. And he talks about this maddened mob of Hibernians, as he describes them. Francis Sheehy Skeffington, of course, dead in 1916, but Skeffington once described the AOH as the ancient order of hooligans. And from time to time they could be, and O'Sheil and I think the other young Sinn Féin canvassers, they got a sense in West Belfast that you may control nationalist politics now down there, but you'll never control it here. This is our patch. And who stands for Sinn Féin in that constituency? Only Eamon de Valera, and de Valera performs abysmally there. Yeah. So what the AOH have, they hold, and they're willing to go out in the streets and get into those street fights. It's green on green violence in one sense. It's two tribes within Irish nationalism fighting for the streets there.
Yeah. But of course, that's the only contested seat in the north of Ireland between nationalists and the Irish Parliamentary Party and Sinn Féin. There was a pact that was organised to not split the nationalist vote in the north, organised by the Archbishop to make sure that whatever happened, a nationalist would get in and not allow a unionist to get in. As it happened, or as it turns out, when the pact was broken in one constituency, this did allow the unionist candidate to actually claim victory. So although they were very successful in West Belfast in terms of holding the nationalist vote there, we don't really know how well they would have done in other constituencies. It is likely that they would have done better than they had done in the south for the reasons that you mentioned about the fact that they had contested elections in the north. So the Irish Parliamentary Party had, I think, 49 uncontested constituencies in the previous election in 1910. And the party had not much experience of fighting elections in the south of the country. In the north, it was a different question. They had been continuously fighting with unionists and running against unionists, which meant that the party machine was much more well-oiled than it was in other parts of the country, which may explain why they were able to fight off the Sinn Féin challenge in West Belfast.
It's a great clash of political brands, though, isn't it? Like Wee Joe in one corner and in the other corner De Valera. I mean, these are two giants of Irish political history. And while the De Valera brand was certainly powerful in other places, it didn't succeed here. De Valera is probably the most famous Irishman in the world, you know, at that moment in time. The following year, he embarks on that amazing kind of lecture tour of the United States. And the badges are sold on the streets up Dev, but that magic didn't seem to transcend in West Belfast.
Yeah. There is a real muddled picture going on in Belfast, as you said. So what after the dust had settled, what was the situation on the ground then? I
think what's often overlooked when we analyse the 1918 election results is the fact that 4 of the seats in Belfast go to so-called Labour Unionist candidates, and that Labour Unionist alliance had been established by none other than Edward Carson himself. So the fear of socialism is very real in Belfast at the time. And think about Belfast, her economic fortunes have always been aligned to those of Glasgow. You have things like the Red Clydeside around this time too, John McLean, a very strong left wing on the docks of Glasgow, and indeed in the docks of Liverpool and right across these islands. So I think the fear of the left was very strong, and that Labour Unionist bloc very much presented themselves as working class men, yes, but also a barrier against Bolshevism. And the line that's being pushed all the time in the Unionist press in Belfast is that Irish Labour is in the hands of Connellyites. It's interesting that term is used, Connellyites and Bolsheviks. So that shouldn't be overlooked. I mean, the success of Labour Unionists here is very significant. And Winnie Carney, one of the great heroes of the age, and very much forgotten, I think. Winnie Carney, who, fair play to her, stands in a ward, but she was never going to be elected, is defeated by one of those Labour Unionist candidates. Yeah. So I think one great part of the story is that Winnie Carney, her election manifesto explicitly says that she stands for a workers' republic, which is definitely not Sinn Féin policy going into the 1918 election. I mean, Griffith and others around him see Sinn Féin as a party that unifies all social classes, and the social questions can wait until the national question is resolved. So not only does she run in a staunchly unionist constituency, she runs on the promise of a workers' republic. Incredibly brave.
Yeah. So obviously the representation of the People Act is a big factor.
It is.
But overhanging all of this is the end of World War I.
Yeah, it's a khaki election, and that's the question. In England, the slogan is "Make this country fit for heroes to live in." These men are coming back from the trenches of Europe, and we need to build a Britain that will honour them and will reflect that. But in the end, there was no great change in British politics when you look at the outcome of the election over there. And the Labour Party, who many people believed would sweep the board as a result of the representation of the People Act, that didn't happen. I do think it's interesting as well that in February of 1918, the representation of the People Act goes through Westminster with very little opposition. It passes kind of overwhelmingly. And I think suffragettes in England, many of them had put their campaign on ice when the First World War began. They did their patriotic duty. And I think they'd proven themselves, if you will. And many parliamentarians who'd been incredibly hostile to votes for women in 1914 were happy enough to hand them over in 1918.
And Carson would have been one of those who was
very much so. Dillon, no better example than Dillon of the Parliamentary Party. I think he said that it would be the end of Western civilization if the vote was put into the hands of women. And he said it may happen in your time, but it will not happen in mine. Unfortunately, it did.
Just to wrap up things, just your opinion on the legacy of the 1918 general election within an Irish context.
So I think the 1918 election is extremely significant for Irish nationalism, for the rise of Sinn Féin, but probably most important of all is that it gives a democratic legitimacy to the Sinn Féin movement. This is an endorsement, if you want to put it that way, by the Irish people of a policy that is going to be more radical than what has come before. It is one that in their manifesto they set out their aims and what they will try and do. They will abstain from taking their seats in Westminster, and they will petition the Paris Peace Conference that will happen to try and go and legitimise the nation over the heads of the British administration. So I think in terms of a change of direction, this is clearly a big moment, and the election itself does boost the credentials of the Sinn Féin party. They then set up their own parliament in the Mansion House in Dublin in January 1919, and the road towards what we know as Irish independence today begins. You
mentioned Paris. We shouldn't lose that global context that's so important, you know, and people are looking at this new Europe that's emerging. And this is not only, I suppose, as far as Sinn Féin are concerned, it's a retrospective mandate for the Rising, but I think for many people it's also important in the context of this new carving up of Europe. And when the First World War ends on the Falls Road in Belfast, they're flying the stars and stripes, you know, on every flagpole, because they believe that the freedom of small nations and all of this that's ahead, Ireland will be important to those discussions. So in a global context, I suppose it would have given people great hope going into those great debates over the future of Europe and where it lay. Meeting in the Mansion House in Dublin in January 1919 and declaring themselves, I've always loved that when they meet in the Mansion House, they read the roll of every elected Irish MP, and they get to it eventually, and it's Edward Carson Oslaugher. You know, he wasn't present that day. But when they get to the Mansion House and they present themselves as the legitimate government of Ireland, and that's remarkable for a movement that is really just being, I would argue, reborn in 1917 and 1918, to be confident enough by January 1919 to proclaim themselves the legitimate government of Ireland. And they read that programme, that message to the free nations of the world, in English, Irish and French. You know, so they see themselves very much as emerging statesmen. On the same day that they met in Dublin at Salahead Beg in Tipperary, the War of Independence begins. You know, Dan Breen, Sean Tracy, and that ambush without sanction from the Dáil. I mean, Dan Breen says in his memoir, Tracy said to me, if you want to start a war, you have to go and kill a few people. And that's why we did it. You know, the Dáil gave no mandate to the War of Independence beginning. It's just one of those flukes of history that on the same day that these parliamentarians met in Dublin, those shots were fired in Tipperary. But in popular memory and in popular history, they're intrinsically linked, you know, and this is the beginning of the War of Independence in some ways.
We also shouldn't forget that by 1916, 1918, the Irish Parliamentary Party had achieved most of what it had set out to do. It had, through the various land acts of the late 19th century and the early 20th century, achieved a social revolution in Ireland, one that was relatively peaceful. It had achieved the first large-scale social housing programme in the world, in the Labourers' Acts, which resulted in 50,000 houses being built in rural Ireland. And of course, it had achieved its most important aim, which was to get Home Rule onto the statute book in 1914. These were notable achievements, and they were achieved through the hard work of the Irish Parliamentary Party. But I think that fact itself and the results of the 1918 election suggests that something quite dramatic happened between 1916 and 1918 that meant that people played down those achievements. Even though the Irish Parliamentary Party was trying to show their record, you know, versus a party that had nothing on their record in terms of achievements. The fact that this didn't seem to carry much weight in the 1918 election, I think, is also very important.
Okay, thanks. I'd just like to thank my guests, Dr. Alan de Bromhead from Queen's University Belfast and historian Donal Fallon.